Thank you, Secretary Albright. Thank you both for that wonderful introduction and for your inspiration and for your example. As you may be able to detect, I am an enthusiastic fan of the Vice President and managed to shout myself absolutely hoarse last night in response to a stirring speech on the floor of our convention. So I hope you can bear with me as my voice is a little bit raspy, even if my heart was uplifted by what both Senator Tim Kaine and Vice President Joe Biden had to say to us last night. Thank you very much. To Ken Wallach, for always having his eye on the ball, not just leading NDI, but having an eye for the details that help make the life of public service sometimes a little easier. First, thank you. Thank you for making the trip. Thank you for taking the time and investing the energy and the attention to join us here in Philadelphia at the Democratic Party's Quadrennial National Convention. I know for many of you, this was a trip from a great distance. And whether you are a party official or an elected leader or a minister or an ambassador, it is a great honor for me to have an opportunity to be with you. It is my view that as people who are passionate about democracy, as people who care deeply about how individuals have their voices heard, and how we have a role in the future of our communities, our countries, and our world, I'm excited for a chance to share with you about this remarkable, rambunctious, memorable, uniquely American, but very human exercise called a National Party Convention. As you heard from Secretary Albright, I was raised just a few miles down the road, and so as somebody who grew up in the shadow of Philadelphia, I was dragged by my teachers and parents as a young boy to all the sites where the revolution that America carried off against the greatest imperial power of the age happened. And I thought, as do most Americans, that of course everybody believes in democracy, and of course democracy is just sort of part of the furniture, the architecture of the world. And it wasn't until I grew up and became a little older and had a chance to travel in the United States and then around the world that I realized the extent to which democracy is genuinely hard. It requires a passionate commitment. It's messy and difficult. It's unpredictable and hard to sustain. And as we think about where we are in the world today and the forces arrayed against democracy, I think it's worth taking a moment to pause and say how important it is that we reflect on what happened here in Philadelphia 240 years ago and how far we have come in the United States in our steady search of a more perfect democracy, and how far so many of you have come and how much you have to teach us. It is perhaps possible that in a previous speech to an NDI conference like this, an American senator might have seemed a little arrogant, might have suggested that American democracy has it all right. But I never would have been inclined to give that speech, but certainly this year, certainly at this time, the candidates and their conduct suggests an attitude of humility is appropriate on my part after we've witnessed both Cleveland and Philadelphia. As you heard from the Secretary, I have the opportunity, as someone who serves on the Foreign Relations Committee and on the Appropriations Subcommittee that funds our State Department and our development assistance, to travel fairly regularly. I've been to 56 countries. A particular area of focus and passion for me is Africa, and I've been to 24 countries on the continent, some of them many times. Because as a young man, as a junior in college, I spent a semester at the University of Nairobi, and 2 years later, I spent months working with the South African Council of Churches, and my insight into the struggles of a young democracy in Kenya and a nation still living with the racial oppression of apartheid in South Africa made it clearer than ever to me. The vision I remember having when I first really encountered South Africa was of an amazing people in a tug of war with the forces of intolerance and authoritarianism in that particular country in that time cast as racial oppression. But if you think about where we are in the world today, rising authoritarianism, a global refugee crisis, the challenges of economic growth and opportunity, we have to recognize that we confront some of the toughest challenges democracy has ever faced. As I travel around the world in my duties as a United States Senator, I've often had conversations, usually more private than public, in which questions are raised, first gently, then pointedly, about the messiness and the difficulty of democracy, about the annoyance of journalists, about the demands of constituents, about the consequences of having a central state that is really not a central state, that lacks the authority to make people do things because of the separation of powers and because of our federalist system. And ultimately, I have to confront the ascendancy of both a Chinese model and a Russian model of how to accomplish development and how to accomplish sustained growth, at least in the countries I have visited recently. And I have to recognize that the conduct of our own campaigns here and now, and certainly the statements of one of our presidential candidates, makes folks around the world question whether the messiness of democracy as practiced in America is worth it. Whether, as some of us say colloquially, the juice is worth the squeeze. Let me suggest to you that as somebody who began in local government, I believe deeply that it is. I started this morning by visiting with the Delaware delegation. And I'll tell you that the very first office I was ever elected to, other than student government, was as a delegate to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1996. As a then very young man with a lot more hair and a heck of a lot thinner, I exhausted myself every bit that week in Chicago as I have this year, and I was inspired and uplifted by the words of one William Jefferson Clinton that year as much as I was this year. But I also was exposed directly to what American party conventions mean. It's not just late night parties. It's not just camaraderie on the floor with your delegation. There's also a lot of debate and discussion in the course of our caucuses and primaries, and in the formation of our party platform, and in the conduct of our convention about policy. Our party conventions are not just about anointing one candidate or another. As you've seen here in our convention and in our primaries, we are having a real and renewed and vigorous debate about isolationism and internationalism, about whether or not trade agreements are good for American workers, about the balance between privacy and security, and who has access to whose emails seems to be the only thing we can talk about today in the American press. It is important what our delegates do here and the debates that we have. And I hope if there is something inspiring about this messy undertaking, it is no least that we conceive of our parties as vehicles for policy, not just for personages. When the founders of this modern nation gathered here in Philadelphia some 240 and again 230 years ago for the Declaration of Independence and for the Constitutional Convention, they didn't imagine that parties would be a feature of modern America. It wasn't something that our founders thought they would embrace. In fact, it was something they spoke against. So I point to that briefly in passing just to remind all of us that the American experiment in democracy has had to be revised and reinvented, modified and amended over and over in the course of our history. As we've gone back and forth in a pendulum, as we've had conflicts and even one of the worst civil wars in human history, we continue to struggle together towards making our nation a democracy. We obviously aren't there fully yet, and we've got a great deal to learn from all of you. But as a person who has started in local government in exactly the sort of office that Harry Truman first held to, as a county executive, which is one of the lowest, most local, most engaged with constituent offices you can imagine in our country, I had the experience of being accountable and being responsive and engaging with constituents who confronted me with complaints day in and day out about things as inspiring and exciting as sewer backups, police response times, building permits, and library hours. And I frankly think it makes a terrific national political leader. And one of the reasons I love Tim Kaine and we serve well together is that he didn't begin his career in national or in public service with soaring speeches about democracy. He began as a city councilman on the Richmond City Council, which means that he too, please a round of applause for Tim Kaine. And I'll tell you that the very first time I met Secretary Clinton, I was working with a nonprofit that was focused on educational opportunity for children from families who didn't have the school fees, the resources to send them to higher education. I was working on a startup project in my home state of Delaware, and she was working on one in Arkansas. When we elevate and elect people who have tackled and solved local problems, when we elevate and elect people who've been involved as delegates in our conventions and who've helped our parties shape their platforms, we show that as a democracy, we value leaders who begin at the very lowest level and who never forget for whom they work, whom they serve, and why they came here. One of the reasons I'm most excited about the speech we will hear tonight and about the future service of Secretary Clinton, forgive me, I'm not going to be too partisan today, but I will simply say this is the National Democratic Institute, and I happen to be a Democrat and an enormous fan of the Secretary. It was in our first trip overseas together that I got a deep appreciation of her journey of service. We traveled together to the inauguration of the President of Liberia. And you know that Secretary Clinton is a seasoned, senior, and experienced leader of our country. But what I got to see there was how determined and tough she is in engaging, because that inauguration was a difficult and dangerous undertaking. Right up until the day it happened, there were still opponents of her election who were rumored to be likely to disrupt the undertaking. And the security assessment of what was to happen that day was not yet safe enough that she was approved to be present on the platform. And yet I got to watch President Sirleaf, Nobel Peace Prize winner, give a powerful and remarkable speech in sweltering 98-degree heat and 90% humidity, reminiscent of this week together in Philadelphia. And as we all sat beneath fluttering flags that look remarkably similar to America's own, we heard someone stand and speak and lead her nation forward through reconciliation, accomplished not at the end of a gun, but through an election and through a personal, committed leader. Secretary Clinton made that trip when she was completely exhausted, having just returned from a trip to China and to Germany, and it reminded me that she is passionate, not just about engaging with 3 or 4 of the most prominent economies or the most powerful of our allies or adversaries, but that she's personally passionate about the pathway towards democracy in countries that are sadly too often overlooked in the conversations of leaders around the world. I am optimistic that she and I together will continue a journey of engagement and support with you. Let me close by sharing a brief story about a recent trip that I took with Rob Liberatore and many others through the Faith and Politics Institute. A congressman named John Lewis, who led the iconic March on Selma and who was the author of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, its inspiration and its defender in the modern Congress, and who recently conducted a sit-in on the floor of the United States House of Representatives in order to try and advance gun safety. Congressman Lewis and Congressman Hoyer and I led a delegation, along with the daughter of Bobby Kennedy, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Bobby Kennedy's Ripples of Hope speech in Cape Town. And we had, while there, the opportunity to meet with and hear from leaders of the liberation struggle and modern-day elected officials from South Africa. We have so much to learn from each other about the challenges of engaging youth, about the demands of a digital economy and communicating with each other, about unemployment and opportunity, and about how to create genuine, multi-party, multiracial, inclusive, functioning democracies. It was a memorable and powerful trip, one that reminded me that we in the United States still barely succeed 50% voter participation. One of the most enduring images to me of that struggle for democracy was those who stood in line not for minutes, not for hours, but for days to cast their first vote for President Nelson Mandela. And one of the most inspiring things that President Mandela did was not just to be inclusive and forgiving after being someone who suffered through decades of the deprivations of apartheid, but someone who resigned his position in accordance with his constitution and in a timely fashion, despite the fact that he literally could have been president for the rest of his life. And we could easily contemplate the possibility that there was no comparably qualified successor. That courage, That leadership is rare. And as all of us struggle to make our parties more perfect and our democracies stronger, let me just briefly reflect in closing on the things we talked about on the trip to South Africa. Not one iconic individual, because democracy can't work if all we do is wait and pray for the next Mandela. Democracy works not through strong men, but through strong institutions, through independent courts, through vibrant journalists and press institutions, through civil society, and through parties that are the vehicles of dissent and dissenting policies and voices. It is my faith, deeply, that we together can make the path of democracy clearer and stronger in this most difficult decade, but we can't take it for granted. In this election, it's my hope that the American people will make the right choice, that we won't withdraw from some of our most vital and most important treaty commitments, such as NATO, that we won't reduce our passion for, support for, engagement with some of the most vital international organizations like the United Nations, that we will continue to fight for our fundamental values of openness, of tolerance, and of freedom on which democracy depends, and that we will continue to recognize our common humanity. But I'll also say that outcome is not certain. This will be a very close election. This will be a hard-fought and hard-won election. And I worry that there is afoot in my country today some of the darkest strains in our history, strains of isolationism and nativism and division, of which I am not proud. Democratic, free, fair, and open elections are the best and greatest way to have these vibrant and difficult conversations. And so when I have a chance to visit with you, either here or in your home countries, and to urge you forward in the work of making democracy real, please understand that I'm also humble about the very real limitations we face in our country. We can learn so much from each other about how to get this right and about how to make it possible for this to be the freest century in human history. Thank you. Thank you. I would be thrilled to take your questions, but I also understand you've had a very long and demanding week, so I will not take too long. But I would welcome a couple of questions, input, or advice. If I can, I'll take 3 questions. And I don't think I've got someone running around with a microphone, so I'm going to have to call you out myself, and you'll have to be brave and loud, or you're welcome to enjoy lunch. Do we have? There is a mic. Sorry, I'm doing what we call in American football calling an audible, which is a deeply confusing thing for a speaker to do. Is there anyone who has a question who would like me to answer it? If not, I'm happy to enjoy lunch. Please.
Good afternoon, Senator. Thank you so much for a really thought-provoking speech. My name's Patrick Grady. I'm a Scottish National Party member of the House of Commons, here with a couple of cross-party colleagues from London. And of course, we've just been through the European referendum and the Brexit result, which I think many of us would think is sort of symptomatic of some of the forces that you spoke about, the upset and the dislocation that so many people feel in democracies around the world. I wonder if you have any reflections on that and whether you think there are any lessons of the experience we've just been through that other countries might be able to learn.
I would rather ask you the same question, sir. I'll tell you that as a person of Scottish ancestry and a friend of John Nicholson's of some 30 years, it is an honor to meet you. I spent as a student a week in Edinburgh with a friend who was an SNP member and is now a member of the Parliament, debating the idea of a Scottish independence referendum, which I'll remind you back then seemed a complete fantasy. My concern, this is a superficial response because I haven't given any deep thought to the meaning of the Brexit referendum and what it means for the United Kingdom. First, I worry that it may mean the end of the United Kingdom, that it may mean that there will be a realignment of the component parts of the UK. But I don't know, and I don't mean to drag us into a territory not welcome. But it does lead us to reflect on a simple point. I went to bed the night before the vote, confident, even optimistic, that the vote would be to remain. As I went to bed the night before the vote in Quebec, that the vote ultimately would be to remain a part of a united Canada. And I woke to be quite surprised about the strength of the outcome. I'm still convinced that giving people the chance to go to polls and express themselves is the right way, writ large, for us to resolve great questions. But I think some significant miscalculations were made. And I worry that the consequences of Brexit were not fully and thoroughly examined by the people of Great Britain. It is not my place to judge their vote, but I too have been through elections where I'm convinced that those whose interests were most at stake participated least, and those whose voices were heard were most strident and least informed. There is something afoot in America, in the United States, in Europe and the world, where average voters are disregarding the advice and input of so-called experts or elites. And we who are in elected service to our constituents would be wise to pay heed to the number of our citizens and constituents who are convinced that their governments do not serve them. And so I'll simply say it is a task for us in the United States and Congress to be more functional and to be more responsive and transparent. And in the absence of doing that, I suspect we will see more referenda around the world that reflect comparable results, where the advice and input of leaders, advisors, and elites about the economic and social consequences of disunion will be disregarded. Thank you, sir. If I could, please, ma'am. We're going to get you a...
Pia Locatelli from the former European Member of Parliament, former member of the European Parliament, at present member of the Italian Parliament. This morning we had a very interesting panel on foreign affairs in the world. And I was a bit surprised and also upset by the fact that not once the European Union was mentioned in that panel. I ask you, how do you foresee the cooperation between the future Clinton administration and the European Union? I think it should be a synergic cooperation to build peace in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Obviously, I don't speak for the Clinton administration, the hoped-for future Clinton administration. But I'll tell you, as someone who believes strongly in institutions that we have seen emerge in the world in the aftermath of the Second World War and in the context of the Cold War, from NATO to the EU to many others, I think it is vital that we continue to engage with and to respect and to strengthen, if possible, institutions that make possible a Europe that is united, free, and secure. And the EU is under enormous stress, partly as a result of the Brexit, partly as a result of the refugee crisis, partly as a result of economic strains. It is my hope that American leaders, that leaders of the United States, will engage with the EU as an institution, as well as with individualized European countries, because it is important that we have such institutions. I spent a great deal of time engaged in a review of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action around the restraint of Iran's nuclear weapons program. The EU played a vital role, and I think that is underappreciated in American politics, that having institutions like the EU that can speak is important. On the continent of Africa, we have in SADC and in ECOWAS and in the East African community emerging entities that can play a comparable role, both in addressing conflict and in promoting growth and opportunity. And I see these as hopeful developments and ones that we will have to nurture to have a more positive future for this century. Thank you for your question, ma'am. I've got this gentleman, if I can.
Thank you very much for your comments. I just want to know what will be the future or the new African policy for the new administration, because over the week we did not hear much about this, and historically since President Clinton, we have seen presidents coming in with specific programs. For example, Clinton came with AGOA, where the trading agreement we're allowed to sell our goods and services into the US without tariffs. President Bush came with PEPFAR, and Millennium Challenge Corporation. President Obama continued with Millennium Challenge Corporation, but also Power Africa for energy. What do we see for President Clinton, the new President Clinton #2?
Well, thank you for the question. Obviously, I can't commit anything for a future President Clinton. But one of the things that President Obama did most successfully, in my view, was to retain those portions of his predecessor's Africa policy that were most important and most effective. So we worked together to reauthorize and extend AGOA. We worked together to reauthorize and extend and fund the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which now has regional compact authority. We worked together to sustain PEPFAR and to also expand it into other communicable diseases. And Power Africa has just been authorized by the American Congress on a bipartisan basis. One of the really positive places in modern American politics is the genuine cooperation between Republicans and Democrats in the Congress and the presidency around U.S. Africa policy. So I am very hopeful that a President Clinton will continue some of the most effective parts of the U.S. Africa policy of her three predecessors, and will continue to make progress on development financing so that we will have a more robust and more modern and more streamlined way for American entities and African entities to work together on infrastructure of all kinds, whether it's power infrastructure or transportation infrastructure or communications infrastructure. I am optimistic that we will have a relationship of equals and that we will build on the framework of AGOA and accelerate African access to American markets and trade capacity through capacity building. And I am confident that we will find ways to work together both to address issues of fragile states by strengthening African-led security solutions for the continent, and to accelerate a perception and a reality in American business that the continent of Africa is the most promising continent of this century. We are about to have the U.S.-Africa Business Forum in New York. I am very optimistic that a President Clinton will embrace the African diaspora in America and the real potential for a much higher level and stronger U.S.-Africa relationship in the 4 years to come. Thank you for your question. My last question will be to this gentleman.
Senator, thank you very much for the inspiring speech, Daniel Mitsov, Bulgarian Foreign Minister. Very much agreeing with what you said about the institutions, and that democracy is built basically by institutions, not only by individuals. Very much I agree with you, and my question is, don't you think that when it comes to foreign aid and reach out to help other countries, US, the European Union, the whole democratic community which is involved in this type of activity, focuses too much on the idea of building exactly hardware infrastructure, building hospitals, roads, providing electricity, water, and so, which is brilliant and wonderful, and we need to continue doing this. But we don't pay too much attention on building institutional infrastructure, because very often what we have built could be easily destroyed by non-existent environment in which these improvements can survive. Because people run away not only from guns, they run away from corruption, they run away from non-functioning institutions, from the lack of rule of law, from the authoritarian regimes, and this is actually what we also need to change. And if we look at the development agenda of the United Nations, all the good governance practices are there. We need to implement them, and we need to persist and invest in them. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. One of the things that makes me most optimistic about the Sustainable Development Goals, about the SDGs, is their focus on not just the important quantifiable human outcomes, such as reduction in disease or access to clean water, but also the institutional consequences of which you're speaking. The elimination of corruption, for example, the functioning of electoral systems, for example. We were just talking about the Power Africa or Electrify Africa initiative of President Obama. One of the ways in which it demonstrates that we as a country are beginning to embrace exactly the view that you suggest is that rather than just focusing on giving grants to build certain power plants or certain electrical distribution lines, Power Africa really has been focused on changing systems, regulatory systems, rate-paying systems, so that there can be sustainable electrical infrastructure for nations across Africa where those countries are leading those decisions and where those countries are making those reforms. Outside of the Africanist context, I don't know if that's well known, but I do agree with you that making change in the way that whole institutions work, whether it's the free press, the work against corruption, or structures and institutions such as democracy that reflect the will of the people, is the most important work we can do. I'm going to close with just a brief observation. Thank you for your questions. One of the most important changes in American democracy was an amendment to our Constitution. It was adopted 100 years ago in 2020. It was the constitutional amendment that allowed American women the right to vote. Hard fought, hard won. In 2021, there will be another centennial. The centennial of a tragic event where one of our most inspiring presidents, FDR, contracted polio. And as a young man, had his life changed and suffered from polio the rest of his life. My hope is that in 5 years, the world community will have succeeded in eradicating polio from the face of the earth. And that will remind us that if we work together, if we build institutions that care about the health and well-being of average individuals all over the world, there's no limit to the good we can accomplish. And I think these two centennials are connected, because I believe it is much more likely we will achieve that centennial, the eradication of polio from the planet, if we achieve that centennial of the right to vote for women in the United States with Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton as the President of the United States. Thank you for a chance to be with you.